The largest naval war in history took place in the Pacific Ocean during World War II, where the Empire of Japan and the United States fought the first combination of naval air forces on a deep geostrategic level. A lot has changed since then, especially in fields like aviation, navigation, logistics, intelligence, naval engineering, and others that didn't even exist at the time, such as artificial intelligence, drones, stealth technology, energy weapons, and so on. However, despite all these changes, the strategic foundation combined with geopolitics has remained. Thus, the Chinese, aware of the past, are planning today with an eye on the war in the Pacific in the future. That's why in today's video we're going to see what the Chinese have learned from that conflict. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, share the video with everyone you know, and consider becoming a member of the channel. Not only will you get early access to several videos that haven't been released to the general public yet, but you'll also have access to exclusive live streams and direct interactions with me, participation in the Telegram group, and you'll be able to access the courses I'm gradually making available to members. And most importantly, of course, you'll help me keep bringing you genuine geopolitics content. Your support is essential for me to keep this channel going. I'm Geopolitica Mundial, and you're watching the Geopolitica Mundial channel. The Chinese Navy, also known as People's Liberation Army Navy, along with Chinese universities, has been studying past wars to understand how other countries deal with the factor of war. They have been carefully studying the Falklands War, the Vietnam War, heavily the Gulf War, and without a doubt now the conflict in Ukraine. They even go quite far back, studying conflicts like the First Sino-Japanese War and World War I, especially in the maritime sphere, from which they have drawn important lessons to improve their effectiveness in case of future conflicts. The little written material that becomes public about these lessons also gives indications about the priorities and preferences of the People's Liberation Army Navy. And everything indicates that the focus has been the Pacific War from 1941 to 1945, and that's no coincidence. Many people might think it's something old and therefore outdated, but the truth is that it was the largest naval war in history, and the strategic and tactical fundamentals are still more or less the same, having only been refined and adapted as new technologies have emerged. Besides that, it was the last time the United States entered a conflict where the enemy had any kind of parity in strength with them. Because since then, the Americans have only gone to war with much smaller and weaker forces that didn't even come close to having the same technological capabilities as they did. Whether they lost or won that conflict is not the focus of the video, because the point is that since World War II, the Americans haven't entered any war where they had a certain level of industrial, technological, and economic equality with the enemy. On December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. From that moment on, the Japanese Navy entered its final but most active phase in its entire history, which would last until August 15, 1945, when the Empire of Japan finally surrendered. People underestimate the capability and ingenuity of the Japanese during World War II. The Japanese were frighteningly innovative and efficient, launching a simultaneous military operation over a geographic area that covered a huge portion of the Earth's surface. In a matter of days, the Japanese simultaneously attacked Europeans and Americans in Asia and the Pacific Ocean. And worst of all, they achieved quick victories using hyper-efficient techniques that the Europeans simply had no chance to react to. Within hours, they attacked and conquered Hong Kong, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. The English defeat in Malaysia, losing the Strait of Malacca and Singapore, was the greatest humiliation in English history. The Europeans were not just defeated, they were crushed and humiliated. Many strategists actually believed that at the time the Japanese could launch some attack against the Europeans in the region, but they were unsure whether the Japanese would have any chance of victory. but absolutely no one thought that the Japanese would defeat the Europeans in the region with such ease and speed. It was only with the large-scale entry of the United States that the fate of the Pacific Ocean would change. At the beginning of the war, the Japanese combined fleet was the third largest navy in the world and had the largest battleships on the planet, but it was completely defeated and destroyed due to poor choices in military and political strategy. In the past, Chinese planners assumed that if China had to fight against the United States, it would be in an extremely unfavorable position. This line of thinking was dominant during the 1990s, 2000s, and 2010s. After all, American military power was often portrayed as so strong that it seemed unstoppable. However, as the People's Liberation Army Navy underwent rapid expansion and modernization, it increasingly expects to be able to compete and fight with the United States Navy on a more equal footing. As such, the lessons of the Pacific War have increasingly resonated with China because the war involved two major naval powers that were initially comparable in technology. Thus, the first lesson is that the economic and industrial power of the two countries was the most important factor and the one that determined the outcome of the war. Chinese analysts recognize the importance of industrial strength, especially in the shipbuilding industry, for waging a prolonged war at sea. For them, the disproportion between the Imperial Japan's economy and its ambitions led to a serious overextension that resulted in its defeat. The destruction of large warships and ground forces only accelerated the depletion of Japan's already limited resources. At the same time, Japan remained involved on the Asian continent in mainland China, placing additional demands on its already scarce resources. That's why the Chinese analyzed the interaction between industrial capacity and the exhaustion of forces on the oceanic battlefield. They concluded that Japan's lack of industrial capacity and trained personnel to recover from combat losses was a critical factor in the final outcome of the war, since Japan lacked both the industry and the raw materials to build warships fast enough to replace the losses suffered in combat. Similarly, the loss of highly trained and experienced fighter pilots who were irreplaceable in operations like Midway or Guadalcanal was a major factor in Japan's downfall, because they simply didn't have the capacity to rebuild their forces fast enough to counter the United States. Interestingly, in general, the Chinese see themselves playing the role of the historical United States in a hypothetical future war in the Pacific. China does not see itself as being in Japan's position, at least economically. And in fact, China's position in the 2020s is in many ways much more similar to that of the United States in 1941 than the current United States is to what it was in the past. China has a dominant position in industrial power and is now established as a first-class technological power, having enough industrial capacity to replace losses suffered in combat. In addition, it is able to import mineral and energy raw materials from Russia and other neighboring countries in huge quantities. On the other hand, in the United States, there are concerns about its Navy's ability to replace losses in a prolonged war at sea. American shipyards simply do not produce warships as quickly as Chinese shipyards. From this point of view, the Chinese strategy is then to try to inflict more losses on the United States Navy than they could replace, mainly using long-range missiles, submarine attacks, and small-scale skirmishes with surface warships. The PLA may suffer losses in its own forces in the process, but this would be acceptable to the Chinese Navy, as these losses would be sustainable for them in the long run. Just as I said that Russia was running a marathon against the West, especially Europe, in other videos, while the Westerners were running a 100-meter dash, the Chinese have also shown that they are betting on the same logic, inflicting damage that in the long run becomes unsustainable for the United States. China's ability to increase attrition and sustain losses means that the United States would have difficulty keeping up with the war in the long run. In Beijing's view, the United States' industrial base and naval industry have declined over the years due to decades of neglect and mismanagement. This means that today it is the United States forces that face a real limitation of resources, just as Japan did in World War II. That's why, just as the United States contained Japan in distant waters by creating a so-called defense perimeter, China would now focus on keeping its adversary away from the continent. Furthermore, in the Pacific War, both countries were innovative in using land-based air power and aircraft carriers to carry out air strikes against enemy warships. Now, China has an arsenal of land-based anti-ship ballistic missiles and aircraft to attack enemy warships, in addition to having highly modern combat ships with ever-increasing range. The Chinese military pays special attention to the role of land-based air power at Midway. They note that the United States, with less capable and older aircraft on Midway Island, played critical roles that ultimately led to American success. Long-range reconnaissance by fighters and bombers provided an early warning screen and detected the approaching Japanese fleet, buying precious time for the small defending force to respond. Although the aircraft launched from Midway were practically useless against the Japanese carriers, they at least managed to distract the Japanese fleet long enough to give the Americans a chance to deliver a decisive blow with carrier-based aviation. Another important battle is the Battle of Guadalcanal. Chinese commentators see the American capture of Henderson and the successful defense of that airfield against Japanese counterattacks as crucial for victory at Guadalcanal. The struggle for control of the airfield was the turning point of the campaign on the island, with the Imperial Japanese Army suffering increasingly heavy and, as a result, unsustainable losses. The American aircraft launched from the airfield provided air support for ground operations, defended against Japanese air attacks, attacked enemy convoys, and even sank important Japanese warships. On the other hand, due to the distance separating Habao Air Base from the operational area, Japanese aircraft could not operate long enough or in sufficient numbers to influence the outcome of the battle. In the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, control of land-based airfields was once again vital. The invading American fleet was subjected to heavy and relentless attacks by Japanese land-based aircraft, including the kamikazes. At the beginning of the campaign, United States forces failed to eliminate many airfields in Kyushu, exposing the United States fleet to constant air attacks. But when the Americans managed to capture 2 airfields in Okinawa, they were then able to change the course of the battle. In a major naval war against the United States, China would then employ firepower in the form of precision missiles launched from the mainland to disable or sink the most important ships of the United States Navy, its aircraft carriers. Chinese long-range fighters and bombers like the H-6J and the J-16 also have enough range to engage with United States fleets far from the Chinese mainland. Chinese missiles can also be used against United States air bases in Asia and the Pacific, putting them out of action for long periods and destroying aircraft on the ground. The deployment of a Dongfeng 26 intermediate-range ballistic missile in China means that even key United States positions like Guam would not be safe for American air operations. With this, if the Chinese were successful, they could push American air power farther and farther away from the Chinese mainland. Interestingly, the Chinese authors express enormous admiration for the American skill in logistics during the Pacific War. In the Battle of Guadalcanal, for example, with American supply convoys, forward bases, and reasonably good defense of those sea routes, a constant flow of reinforcements, equipment, and supplies was allowed to reach the island, while the Japanese were poorly equipped to resupply their forces in Guadalcanal and other theaters of combat. American attacks on Japanese supply convoys worsened Japan's logistical challenges. The shortage of supplies and reinforcements undermined the Japanese fighting strength, leaving Imperial Army soldiers without food and ammunition during the Guadalcanal campaign. This deficiency could be observed in New Guinea, Myanmar, and the Philippines from 1944 to 1945. Chinese analysts also criticized the failure of the Imperial Japanese Navy to attack the vulnerable American supply lines throughout the war and for not focusing their air attacks on exposed American supply depots. Japanese submarine doctrine focused on attacking enemy warships instead of supply convoys, which was quite different from the German U-boats in the Atlantic theater. Japan's pre-war shipbuilding effort was heavily focused on building warships and minimized the construction of transport and supply ships needed to keep its combat forces reinforced and supplied. In other words, Japan prepared for battle but not for war. And that's no coincidence, because the Japanese studied and prepared for this war against the United States using the books of the geopoliticians Mahan and Leah Homer, who even have videos about them here on the channel, who argued that naval wars were centered around a single decisive moment of one great battle. And it's not that these geopoliticians were wrong, because up until World War II, whoever achieved the great victory at sea would determine the outcome of the war, which proved true in World War I and in the Russo-Japanese War. But in the 1940s, the reality of war was already different, and a single great battle that would determine the entire war was no longer realistic. Thus, modern war would not be decided only by the gains and losses of warships or islands, but by the ability to continue developing a nation's industrial potential and convert that potential into sustained combat power at the front lines in a long-term struggle. And considering that modern wars consume enormous amounts of material, putting huge pressure on logistics, China's doctrine requires attacks against the enemy's lines of communication, undermining the flow of essential supplies needed to keep their frontline combat units in action. Thus, the Chinese analysis of the Pacific War brought 4 lessons. The first is that the combined economic, technological, and industrial power of nations is the most important factor in war. The second lesson is that naval warfare in the modern era will be decided by land-based air power, whether in the form of combat aircraft or anti-ship missiles. The third is the importance of logistics and reinforcements. And the fourth is that China sees itself in the position of the United States in 1940 as opposed to Imperial Japan, which would be the role of the United States today. But an important aspect that is ignored by the Chinese lies in the matter of combat experience. After all, the last time the Chinese actually went to war was in 1979 against Vietnam, while the United States, in turn, has been involved in a huge number of wars since then. And although the United States also doesn't have naval warfare experience that would set them apart from the Chinese, on the other hand, they do have experience operating as a combined force, something the Chinese only have training in. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video with everyone you know so I can keep bringing you genuine geopolitics content. Best regards and see you next time.